Excellent. Excellent. So today we're very happy to welcome Arun Kundnani to present his new book, What is Anti-Racism and Why it is Anti-Capitalism. Arun will present, and then our fantastic discussants will also have a chance to interact with this, and then we will open the floor. So let me please start by presenting our speakers today. Arun has been active in anti-racist movements in Britain and the United States for 3 decades already. He is a former editor of the journal Race and Class, and was a scholar in residence at the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture at the New York Public Library. The Guardian has described him as one of Britain's best political writers, which is fantastic. And he's the author of The Muslims Are Coming, Islamophobia, Extremism, and the Domestic War on Terror, which was published by Verso in 2015. And then most recently, which is also the main topic of today's discussion, and also published by Verso, What is Anti-Racism and Why it means Anti-Capitalism. Arun will speak for 12 minutes, and then Vanessa E, Thompson, John Narayan, and Lucia Pradella will speak for 7 minutes each. I will introduce them now as well. Vanessa is an assistant professor in Black Studies at the Department of Gender Studies at Queen's University. Her scholarship focuses on Black studies, anti-colonialism, state violence, and global abolition, critical racism studies, and activist ethnographies. She has published on Black movements in France and Europe more broadly, and Black abolitionist world-making. She recently published Abolition, a Reader in 2002. John Narayan is senior lecturer in European International Studies at King's College London, and an anti-racist scholar of globalization and inequality. His current research centers on abolitionism and the political economy of the influential anti-racist scholar Ambalavanir Sivanandan, and I'm sorry for butchering that pronunciation. Lucia Pradella is reader in international political economy at King's College London as well. She has published extensively on Marx's critique of political economy and on workers' movements, migration, imperialism, and alternatives to capitalism. So with this great panel today, I will start by giving the floor directly to Arun, and he will have 12 minutes to briefly present the book, the main arguments of it, and then, as I said, 7 minutes to each discussant to finally open the floor to everyone. Thank you very much, and thank Arun, you have the floor now.
Thank you, Diego, and thanks to everyone who helped put this together and for everyone who's here. So yeah, I've only got 12 minutes, so I'm going to just give you a taste of the book, and hopefully some of the other parts to it will come out in the other discussions that we have after this 12 minutes. So there's really 2 key arguments in the book, right? So the first argument is that we need to understand that there are 2 quite distinct traditions of anti-racism, right? A liberal tradition, which focuses on individual attitudes and unconscious biases and culminates in today's kind of language of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and a more radical tradition, which understands racism in terms of the unequal structural distribution of resources across racial groups. Okay, so I'm trying to emphasize this distinction between these 2 kinds of anti-racism, and I trace the histories of them through the 20th century. And the second argument in the book is really, and this is probably where I think this group is more kind of relevant for this group. The first part of the argument, I guess most people are already kind of on board with that idea. But the second argument in the book is an attempt to think through what is that structure when we talk about a kind of structural definition of racism. Like, what is that structure? Especially at a time when, you know, in 2020, when we had the Black Lives Matter protests in well, everywhere actually, but in the United States as well, we had Larry Fink, the CEO of BlackRock, talking about how we need to fight systemic racism, right? So everyone, even the CEO of like one of the largest financial corporations of the world, is talking about systemic racism, right? So we kind of, if that's possible, and he can do that without everyone just thinking that's completely ridiculous, then we obviously don't really have a good sense of what systemic racism or structural racism actually means anymore, and we need to get clear on that, right? So the second argument is what do we mean by this structure, and how do we, and that has to mean going back to, once again, thinking about the relationship between racism and capitalism, right? To give you a way into this, I'm gonna just get into one of the people that I write about in the book, open it up from him. So H. Rap Brown was one of the leaders of the Black Power movement in the United States in the late 1960s, early 1970s. In 1971, he converted to Islam, changed his name to Jamil Al-Amin, and he's currently in a federal prison in Tucson, Arizona. He's 80 years old now. My next book is actually a biography of him. But he wrote a book in the late 1960s that no one reads anymore, but which in the last section of the book, he actually lays out an account of what he thinks this relationship is between racism and capitalism. To cut a slightly longer story short, he says, we were brought here as slaves to work. There is no more work, and that's why we are a problem to America. Now the United States has a surplus of Black people. We've outlived our usefulness. And then he, in an interview with a French journalist in 1967, he says, the capitalistic system as it is set up cannot accommodate 40 or 50 million Black people in the United States, right? So what he's arguing here is that the United States is about to engage in a much more aggressive form of policing of Black people in the United States. It's about to engage in a process that we will now call mass incarceration, but in 1969, H. Rap Brown is already seeing this kind of proposals to expand the building of prisons and so on. And what he's saying is that this kind of new, much more violent set of infrastructures of policing and imprisonment that is about to be built is not just a continuation of the past. It's a new thing, and it's tied very much to a kind of contraction of capitalism's need for Black waged labor at this point, right? So the rendering surplus of Black people is the impetus for these new forms of state violence, right? The growing violence of the police and so on, right? So what he's saying is once Black people constitute a surplus population, incarceration and other forms of state violence become the way that capitalism manages that surplus, right? So let me bring out one other thing that Rap Brown's talking about just quickly. So one of the things he's also doing is overturning a kind of liberal narrative that prevails at the time, in which racism in the United States is a legacy of the past that we're always kind of on the verge of overcoming, right? And so, you can imagine how that would be the story in the late 1960s. Like, we've passed the civil rights legislation, we've kind of had one of these moments of racial reckonings, we've kind of recognized the evils of racism, we've dealt with it through legislation. Now we can move on into this kind of post-racial future, right? And the United States, as Europe sometimes does as well, the United States constantly has these moments where it's like, we're now kind of on this moment of overcoming this past. But basically, there's a progressive story there of, we can reform and move forward out of this past that's hanging over us, right? Now, in the United States, of course, that there's a lot of people who find that idea implausible. Most often, the critique of that idea of liberal progress is made from a very pessimistic argument that says nothing has really changed, right? History is kind of flattened out on that view, and usually the term is anti-Blackness is seen as something that's kind of hardwired into Western culture from its formation, and it kind of acts in a kind of uniform mechanical way thereafter, right? And you can see why that would have a plausibility to it. It does, the history, that it does feel like just this kind of relentless violence, this relentless oppression through centuries and centuries, right? And that's the terrain of what what you see in the US right now of culture wars, where on the one side is this kind of progressive story, which even conservatives make nowadays, that that there's something just about the core values of the United States that enables it to kind of move forward and overcome the bad things that happened in the past. Or on the other side, we're still living in 1619, essentially, right? Nothing's really changed, right? And well, Rap Brown is taking neither of those positions. He's saying there's something new happening, right? There's something emerging happening at this time in the late 1960s. That even though on the surface it seems like we're looking at some kind of liberal progress in terms of civil rights legislation and so on, really, if you look a little closer, there's something terrifying on the horizon that's going to be this new forms of violence, like mass incarceration. So he's saying you have to understand the conjuncture if you want to put it in those kind of terms, right? And it means that whatever you think about some supposed kind of founding moment of racism, you know, and there's all kinds of different competing ideas of when that might be and what that might be, you know, pick your century kind of thing. Irrespective of what you think about that founding moment, it doesn't settle the question, as you know, as Stuart Hall would have argued in the 70s, it doesn't settle the question of how and why racism reproduces itself now, right? Yes, white supremacy appears to be this kind of constant feature of modernity, but if you remain at that level of abstraction, you're going to ignore all the movements that have mobilized through those centuries against white supremacy. And for racism to survive, it has to constantly adapt and reconfigure itself in the face of resistance. And the traces of those resistance are always going to be lodged in those reworking structures of racism as they get transformed in response to that resistance. So if you want to understand racism, you always have to understand the resistance to racism, the disruptions of it, right? Now, if we wanted to update those kind of arguments that Rat Brown is making for our analysis today, we'd have to begin with, again, the relationship between surplus populations and racial state violence that he identified as central, right? Neoliberalism has generated populations of people uprooted from pre-existing livelihoods, but unable to be absorbed into neoliberal labor markets on a globally unprecedented scale, right? This is on a much larger scale than what we might have seen before in terms of earlier stages of primitive accumulation, right? And it's these surplus populations, both inside and outside the West, who are the targets of these new infrastructures of violence that neoliberalism has generated, right? It's they who make up the tens of thousands who've fled the destruction of their countries only to suffer the death by policy of drowning in the Mediterranean. It's this same disposable humanity who's been slaughtered on an industrial scale in the global so-called wars on terror, wars on drugs. It's the genocidal war that Israel's waging right now in Palestine is another example, because settler colonialism renders natives as surplus populations as well, which means they're vulnerable to elimination or expulsion. And in the United States, as we said, mass incarceration, the newly aggressive policing since the 1970s can only be explained in terms of its need to manage surplus populations, right? So the global policing of Blacks, of migrants, of Muslims and others, there's meshes with and comes to stand in ideologically for the broader problem of policing neoliberalism's surplus populations within and without the West. It's not coincidental that the think tank networks involved in promoting neoliberal economics, you know, the Institute of Economic Affairs, Manhattan Institute, et cetera, have typically also been the key mobilizers of projects of racist policing, of incarceration, of counterterrorism, of border controls, and so on. So it's not simply that racism has become more subtle or unconscious after its overt forms have been defeated in the second half of the 20th century. It's more that, and this is something that Fanon predicted, as he put it, the rigor of the system makes it superfluous to make a daily assertion of superiority, right? So racial inequalities are reproduced through the systems of market discipline, so in a very anonymous way almost, right? Alongside newly intensifying infrastructures of governmental violence carried out in the name of seemingly race-neutral concerns about crime, migration, and terrorism. Liberal notions of diversity and inclusion are completely compatible with these forms of racist structural violence. White liberals can heroically confront their own unconscious biases all they want, yet these structures will remain. And this is what I think, you know, what I think we've failed to understand in the scholarship above all here on this is that neoliberalism does not just inherit racism as a legacy of the past that it kind of coexists with, but that neoliberalism has been a space in which racism and imperialism have been reworked and restructured, right? And that's precisely what you see happening if you look at the intellectual history of neoliberal thought. So if you take someone like Hayek, I mean, he spends 3 decades trying to develop a theory of the cultural underpinnings of free markets. And he essentially develops a theory that sees markets as dependent on culture and culture essentially as race-like. And that's why he says you need borders to keep out non-white people from Europe. You know, on a purely market-based philosophy, there's no basis for that. You'd want migration to intensify competition in labor markets. But he says the opposite, because for him, markets are dependent on this deeper racial cultural order.
So now, we have 2 more minutes.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think I'll be just on time in that case. Thank you, Diego. So it follows from that argument that the kinds of racist politics that we've seen surge in recent years can't be analyzed as kind of masks with which to conceal a supposed non-racial economic core to capitalism. Rather, they can only be made sense of by understanding that there is a material and social basis of actual racial divisions of labor that provide a kind of legitimacy and a kind of spontaneous folk plausibility to this right-wing racist political rhetoric, right? It's that what makes it possible in the end, that there's a material basis that it plays on. And so the far right is thriving because its rhetoric resonates with that material base and with decades of neoliberal state practice in the name of securing populations from illegal drugs, immigration, and terrorism, and so on, right? It's not simply that they're doing well because they're able to scapegoat and exploit the kind of devastation that neoliberalism wreaks. There's something more than that. They're making explicit a racial ordering that capitalism has always worked through, including neoliberal capitalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aaron. That was great, super succinct, excellent way of starting.
Okay, good.
I will now give the floor to Vanessa. So you have 7 minutes to start this conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the invitation to this event and for putting it together, especially to John and Diego and Lucia. I'm speaking from the lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples from Cataraqui in so-called Canada. And I want to acknowledge the ongoing struggles against settler colonialism, as well as the solidarities between indigenous struggles and Black radicalism on these lands, as well as beyond, especially in this conjuncture of imperial assault and mass violence in Palestine, in which the settler Canadian state actively participates through selling military arms and technologies, ideologically and politically legitimizing the occupation of Palestine, and by repressing and criminalizing solidarity with Palestinians at home and abroad. In this current, and I will read my comments and hope I can stay within the 7 minutes. In this current neoliberal and neocolonial conjuncture, which unfolds alongside the coordinates of the changing same of racial capitalism, Arun Kundnani's book is an important and as timely as ever. The book is a tour de force of the history of radical anti-racist theory and struggle, and how it is embedded in the analysis of and antagonistic internationalist movements against imperial capitalism. In a time in which liberal anti-racism, signaled through privileged discourse and diversity imperialism as a pacifying strategy, is increasingly mobilized as a force to conceal political, economic, and material structures of racism, Arun traces the history of liberal anti-racism to demonstrate that an idealist approach to racism is not only nothing new, but a rationality of the operations of racism itself. Following but also stretching Marx, as Fanon once so powerfully did, Arun challenges the idealist notion of anti-racism, according to which the focus lies on individual racial attitudes, feelings, and beliefs, modes of racial inclusion and diversity, instead of on social and economic structures, the imperial division of labor, and increasing production, management, and policing of so-called surplus populations, which shape racist ideologies and not the other way around. Arun thus urges us to engage with the radical history of anti-racism as one of anti-capitalism of the dark proletariat, to echo Du Bois. Working and weaving through the lives and radical contributions of some of our greatest intellectual and revolutionary touchstones, Anton de Kom, W.E.B. Du Bois, C.L.R. James, Aimé Césaire, Frantz Fanon, Madame Brenda Nath Roy, Claudia Jones, Kwame Nkrumah, Kwame Ture, Jamil Abdullah Al-Amin, Coretta Scott King, Cedric Robinson, Stuart Hall, A. Shivanandan, and many others, Arun actually puts forward a unitary theory of racial capitalism. This means that instead of understanding racism and capitalism as two autonomous or distinct systems that interact with each other or are co-constitutive, the capitalist mode of production operates in combination and through different modes of production and a variety, multiple forms of unfree and less free labor, involving multiple degrees of coercion and root violence, instead of through the universalization of the wage labor form. While accounts on so-called primitive accumulation, which is actually original accumulation as ursprüngliche Akkumulation, from Marx to Rosa Luxemburg, recognized this, they did not draw the consequent conclusions. Third world Marxist analysis and struggle, and we have to be clear that without third world Marxist analysis and struggle, Marxism probably would have never went global and would have probably ceased to exist, provides a universal analysis of the history of capitalism because it attends to the fact that there was not a homogenizing of economic conditions, but rather a complex structure in which different modes of production and forms of labor coexist within one social system. These different modes of production and the various degrees of mass coercion that are enforced to super exploit racialized workers are a permanent and long-term feature of capitalism instead of just primitive or temporary, albeit changing in function and form. Racism, as Arun highlights in conversation with James Fanon and Hall, is therefore not simply an ideology to separate a universal working class, but a mediating factor of the structural differentiation and material contradiction of value, labor, and violence. As Arun notes, and I quote, the structure in structural racism is capitalism's relationship to other incorporated modes of production, and racism is the main way that capitalism manages its inevitable failure to make itself universal. This is what we can use the term racial capitalism to refer to, end of quote. This racial division of labor speaks to real contradictions within and between the various classes and how they relate to capitalist production and exploitation, and derives from imperialism's international racial division of labor. Departing from an internationalist and anti-colonial reading, Arun thus discusses racism as a structural feature between the imperialist centers and the so-called peripheries, which are actually the centers of capitalist development and reproduction. And one of the core contributions of the book, at least in my view, is that Arun mobilizes this crucial unitary theory of racial capitalism that is grounded in the analysis of third world Marxism to interrogate processes of neoliberal restructuring on a global scale. More than just the erosion of the class compromise between white labor and capital in Europe and the US, the neoliberal turn must be understood as a response to decolonization in the third world, radical Black struggle in the US and Europe, and the suppression of Arab radicalism. Radical anti-racism and anti-colonialism, the formal independence and third world socialist struggles in Africa, Asia, and the Caribbean, as well as Arab radicalism especially, produced a political and economic crisis within the capitalist system. Neoliberals, and I quote, saw organized labor in the West and anti-colonial nationalism elsewhere as equivalent and related threats. The smooth operation of capitalism was vulnerable to disruption by collectively organized workers. It was also vulnerable to disruption by collectively organized national liberation movements seeking control over the raw materials the system depended upon, end of quote. Alongside the crisis of welfare capitalism, which is based on the super exploitation of the dog proletariat in the first place, we have to think through the reorganization of colonialism and racism as part of the neoliberal counter-revolution. The imposition of neoliberalism on the third world, a neo-colonial reorganization ranging from counterinsurgency and proxy wars to debtification and structural adjustments programs, as well as to what Harsha Valia calls border imperialism, are articulations of neoliberalism on a global scale. Against this background, racism also changes its form and function, as Arun argues in relation to Hall and Fanon. New conjunctures and forms of racism... 2 more minutes,
if that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you. New conjunctures and forms of racism emerged that urge radical anti-racists to do the work instead of simply projecting a racist past to the present. The racial capitalist neoliberal production of surplus populations, of those no longer needed for capitalist exploitation, managed through policing, prisons, borders, and other carceral methods, is the arena where current racism operates. I've argued elsewhere that carceral racism is one of the dominant forms of racism in this current conjuncture. Carceral racism does not operate solely through the means of exploitation, but especially through the manufacturing and management of surplus, beyond skin color or the naturalization of culture. It is a racism that materializes and naturalizes those groups that are manufactured as disposable through the processes of neoliberal racial capitalism and its production, as well as responses to crisis, such as mass impoverishment, surplusification, wagelessness, and mass displacement, and rationalizes the control, surveillance, and punishment. At the brunt end of carceral racism are the Black and brown unemployed youth in the favelas, the banlieues and ghettos, the illegalized migrant, the global and multiracial houseless and homeless, the incarcerated and detained. Anti-Muslim racism plays a specific role in the configuration of carceral racism. It is the racism that kills, to echo A. Shivanandan, the racism that produces and deals with the fastest growing and most novel social class on the planet, as Mike Davis reminds us. Liberal anti-racism actually conceals these processes and is therefore not only anti-racism misled, but rather part of racism itself. The tour de force provided in this book addresses crucial questions about anti-racist resistance, especially in the current conjuncture. And I would like to end my commentary with two questions to Arun about resistance. Third World and Black Marxists have long shifted the coordinates of anti-capitalist resistance by decentering the focus on the industrial working class as the revolutionary subjects, and by emphasizing the role of the Black enslaved worker, the rural peasants, and the so-called lumpen proletariat, as well as the jobless inner city youth, the migrant worker, and the Black domestic female worker. You also draw on Black materialist feminist critiques, such as put forward by Claudia Jones and Coretta Scott King, and you also highlight how your analysis of anti-racism mirrors the contributions of social reproduction feminists and resistance in the arena of social reproduction. And I was wondering how we can bring these strands further together, as we see unfolding in the work of Claudia Jones, and what a materialist feminist approach to radical anti-racist and anti-colonial struggles look like to you more concretely. Further, while Third World Marxists changed the coordinates of proletarian resistance, their focus is still very much on labor. Hall and others have emphasized less labor-centric modes of resistance to racial capital, but I think in this conjuncture, especially of surplusification and warehousing, we need to work this further through. Could you speak a bit more on the multitudes of surplus resistance? And in relation to that, Palestine plays a crucial role in your book. You highlight the specific significance of the Palestinian struggle within the imperialist system, how Palestine provides the basis to understanding neoliberal restructuring of racial capitalism and its methods of surplusification. Considering the ongoing genocidal violence against Palestinian, but also the international resistance we see currently unfolding, where do you locate the possibility of a reborn radical internationalism in this moment? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. And with no further ado, let's just give the mic directly to John Narayan.
Hey, thank you. Thanks for that, Vanessa. And you didn't steal it, but you thought the last question is one of my questions. So we can double on Arun to answer that question. All right, cool. So what I'm going to do is I always get kind of geeked out actually when I talk to Arun, because I always remind him he's the voice of my early 20s. And I'm a bit older now, so it's always really cool to hang out with him. And essentially, I'm partly in this position due to Arun's work, which basically reconfirmed what anti-racism was to me at a time when anti-racism was more needed than ever, which was the war on terror. So I think Arun's book, and also the death of multiculturalism in Britain, which some of us actually applauded. I think Arun's book is really cool because it sits probably in a genre of literature that has emerged in the last few years, trying to deal with what happened in the summer of 2020 and how we didn't end up where we wanted to end up. So, I would place Arun's book with Race to the Bottom by Shafi and Naji, or Day and McBean's Abolition Revolution, in trying to help us try and navigate how we ended up with EDI and not radical change. And I think, what Arun's done really well in the book is to actually pivot on an old debate that we used to have on the difference between racism and racialism. Yeah. And my dad used to use this term racialism. And I think when I was about 20 or maybe 18, I said, Dad, racialism's not a word. What are you going on about? It's racism. And he said, no, young man. And my dad's a you know, is a left school at 16 forklift driver guy. He was like, no, racialism is a thing and racism is different. And I think what that is the difference between what we're doing. Racialism is the personal prejudices and I don't like someone's skin color or whatever culture, whatever. And racism is the structural embedding of things, right? What we call racialized capitalism in this debate. And I think Arun's book basically shows us how the history of Black radicalism has always, in a sense, been tied to racism, not racialism. And what our institutions now sell us in universities, in EDI commissions, or even at a market level, and I'll talk a bit more about that, is EDI, is racialism, is dealing with racialisms rather than racism, because the system is founded, as Black radicalism tells us, as Third World Marxism tells us, on a racialized form of capitalism. So I'm actually going to skip a little bit of what I wanted to talk about because Vanessa's actually done it so well, so I don't need to talk about that. And I want to hone in specifically on what Arun's doing with the history of neoliberalism. And I guess, like, for me, it was interesting reading the last bit of the book and where you critique Harvey and Wendy Brown and the others. I think you dubbed them the white left. Is that fair? Is that what you call them? Someone said someone said that David Harvey's just bad Marxist. But I mean, white left, bad Marxist, we can roll with it. Ain't naming any names. And here Arun does something, I guess, to me, which is kind of firsthand is to know, but for others may not be. He expands, as Vanessa kind of alluded to, the nature of the neoliberal story. And I think neoliberalism is an interesting beast because about at least 10 years ago, all anyone talked about was financialization. Like when you saw neoliberalism, it was just financialization. People said there was nothing to do with the state. And I remember being like in the anti-racist community going, well, hold on, neoliberalism is all about the state. And I think what Arun does is to kind of update what was happening at that time, where people thought the state was being rolled back. For many of us, the state was being rolled forwards. Whilst welfare was retracted, securitization was happening. At the same time, neoliberalism was the response to what Arun calls an attempt to desegregate capitalism, right? And its desegregation would be anti-colonialism and decolonization. I mean, I would push it a bit further, and I'll try and push that a bit further and say, well, actually, it wasn't desegregation. It was what we call anti-imperialism, which is anti-capitalism, right? So the desegregation would lead to the end of capitalism as we know it if it was to happen properly. So Arun updates this narrative and I think really puts into that double pivot of what happens internationally and what happens domestically as neoliberalism unfolds. And where I want to pick up my story is a bit of what happens to anti-racism in this moment. And I think what happens with anti-racism in this moment is anti-racism as a domestic thing is disattached from anti-racism or anti-imperialism, as I'll try to argue a bit later, as a kind of way forwards. They're disattached from each other. Whereas historically they were aligned, they become disattached in the neoliberal era. So even as the figures that emerge around neoliberalism's racism, again, Vanessa and Arun alluded to this, that neoliberalism is generative of its own forms of racialization, and we're not just dealing with the kind of after effects of social democracy's racism, or even the empire's version of racism, the emergence of what Edward Said called the Arab problem, or what we now call the Muslim problem, even as these figures are globalized, and we could take the war on terror as this is a really good example. So the figure of the Muslim becomes a kind of global scare, a kind of global kind of popular trope. It's domesticized in the nation state as the issue. And here it's culture, here it's integration or incompatibility. So even as it functions as a global level, anti-racism is driven towards national solutions. And this is a big change, I think, from the prior eras of anti-racism that we all loved. And so Arun basically makes the argument that co-option and repression work in tandem, and at times in the policing of these surplus populations. So not only do you have surplus populations who can't integrate, such as the Muslim community, you obviously have the surplus populations from processes of deindustrialization, your urban proletariat, or what would become known as Huey P. Newton would call the unemployables, the expansion of mass surveillance, and the kind of where we end up. And I think that kind of does sit really nicely with bringing us to how we end up in 2020 at the point that we do. So I just want to kind of end briefly by kind of pushing on some of these things and trying to get a bit more, trying to wring a bit more out of the book. One is this, right? That double pivot of neoliberalism for me is correct. Like that's what happens. But the analytical separation between those two things needs to be kind of spelled out a bit more. So not only do we end up with market imperatives at the domestic level. So I'll give you a good example. In Britain, anti-racism becomes the community groups competing for state resources, even when they don't want state resources, right? Even when you want less of the state, you are forced to compete for the resources to be an anti-racist group. And that's the methodologically nationalist bit to it. So your racism is here, you deal with it here, whether through cultural inclusion. But this also happens at the global level, right? Where the third world is disarticulated, disemboweled. And what market imperatives there do is to individualize the nation states themselves. So anti-racism at the international level itself becomes a form of methodological nationalism, because you can only go and instead of commodity cartels like OPEC across things like cocoa, we end up with individualized nation states going to the IMF and doing their own kind of negotiation, right? So in a sense, would it be better to say what is anti-racism and why is it anti-imperialist, rather than why is it anti-racism and why is it anti-capitalist, right? I don't know about this AI companion. I can deal with that.
That's fine.
All right. So that's a question. Is it really the sense that actually anti-racism needs anti-imperialism to be anti-racist? The second is the issue of Palestine that Vanessa kind of wonderfully talked about. Here you invoke the idea of repression, co-option working in different ways. But can we update that in the present? So interestingly, in 2020, there was repression. The state definitely repressed groups who came out for Black Lives Matter. But then we had co-option, right? Like we had, I mean, I'm not going to call Ben and Jerry's co-option because their statement on white supremacy is pretty good. But, you know, Nike, HSBC, any corporation you can met. I mean, we even had Keir Starmer kneeling with Angela Rayner, yeah? And so we had co-option. With Palestine, we've had no co-option. We've had repression. And is there something in that where, I know in the book you say, well, you know, it can be repression or co-option, but is there something in that? Was the abolitionism request itself more co-optable than the current moment? Like, is there something that was more co-optable by this system? And how then, to kind of piggyback on Vanessa's question, does Palestine then offer something else, right? Because there certainly was more co-option, and then the repression continues because the structural violence that abolition is trying to deal with continues. And then finally, you end the book with one of my favorite kind of tales from Siver about the Pentacle Five, right? Like the different paths. Always loved that. And in some ways, I guess that's what the whole Black radical tradition, Black Marxism, Third World Marxism was always trying to do, which was not maybe to because I don't think Marx did it, but maybe some Marxists did it and we're a very wide, broad church. That kind of expansion of the revolutionary subject, right? And so the revolutionary subject never comes to you as written in any book. It comes, as Cedric says, in kind of different garb. And then, you know, the project in the mid-20th century was, how do you connect the dots? And we have wonderful people trying to connect the dots outside of the Black radical tradition, whether that's Malcolm X's Third Worldism and the Black Panthers, any of the groups, right? Is that, though, when we end there, is that now easy as it once was to do without a, say, Third World project, Third World Marxism that then pivots these things? And I just want to give everyone an example to end with, right? So one of my heroes is Malcolm X, and he quite famously says that, you know, you can't straighten out Mississippi without straightening out the Congo. Yeah, you remember, like, you'll never get Mississippi straightened out without understanding what's happening in the Congo. And I think a contemporary anti-racism in Britain, for example, is against the Rwanda plan. Yeah. But at the moment, Rwanda is sponsoring the insurgency in Congo, which is leading to its own genocide and displacement. I mean, it's not in the media as much, but it's certainly a thing. Yet the anti-racism probably that Arun, me and you are kind of in conversation with doesn't really make the link to what's happening in Congo when dealing with Rwanda. So is it possible, is it just so easy to say that we have divergent paths and we're going to end at the end? Or do we need more signposting about how we end up at the same place, even if we go down different paths? Hope that makes sense. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, John. And to finish this first round of interventions, let's welcome Lucia Pradella for the last comment. And after that, I will give the mic back to Arun for a few minutes just so he can wrap up and respond to all the first round of comments. Up to you, Lucia.
Okay, thanks so much. I just want to say solidarity to Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, and across historical Palestine. If you're at King's tomorrow at 11 a.m., we will walk out with the students at 11 in the Strand. And you can also join us at 12 in front of Downing Street, where we will join the students on strike, school and university students on strike. Okay, so thanks so much. I will start timing me now. I just want to say this is a great book that I think contributes to our understanding of racism and to ground our understanding of racism in the imperialist structures that produce and sustain racism. I have a great admiration from Arun's work since when I was young, which is a bit earlier than John. So I hope I won't basically embarrass myself this evening. And I want to start with actually Arun's quote from Jamil Al-Amin that we have to begin to talk about revolution. And so that's actually what I would like to focus in my talk. And I want to stress that from my point of view, what Arun does in this book is not just to put forward the structural understanding of racism within the structures of imperialism, but also look at how racism changes in response to social resistance and resistance movements. And this is going back to Stuart Hall. And this is a seminar in contemporary Marxist theory, so I'm happy to play the part of the kind of old school Marxist and actually look at what John was saying about the relationship between anti-racism, anti-imperialism, and anti-capitalism. Just the kind of, I just want to say I don't agree with you, John, so just to add a bit of pepper to this discussion. So I think it's quite interesting that Arun goes back to the debate between Lenin and Roy about world revolution. And this is also something that was developed at the Baku Congress. And this is a complete accident that I have here to see the dawn, which is basically the reports of the Congress were basically the first Congress of the peoples of the East that set up to achieve a union of workers and oppressed people in the holy war against world capitalism. And it's also interesting that Lenin relies on Marx to develop his idea of permanent revolution, and he uses in particular Marx's writings on Ireland. And these writings, in my view, are important to understand how Marx overcomes what I kind of agree with you. It's a Eurocentrism in his understanding of international revolution in the Communist Manifesto. And also it's important to challenge the idea, which I think we disagree, that in Capital Marx was focusing on a self-enclosed national economy, which is also what Harvey and I think Cedric Robinson believe. So I also, it's great that Vanessa is from Germany. She talked about ursprüngliche Akkumulation, which is not a primitive accumulation, is a foundational accumulation that persists also in the industrial area, according to Marx. And if we look at Ireland, we see like how in the industrial era, from his point of view, these processes of direct violence persisted and coexisted with the violence of accumulation sans phrase, especially in the agricultural a sector which, along with ecological catastrophe and famines, were actually pushing people out of the countryside. And when Marx understands the industrial reserve army of labor of British capital, he also includes the impoverished peasants of Ireland, whose labor was actually essential to produce the cheap, the cheap raw materials and potatoes and whatever that were necessary for the reproduction of English capital, but also produced the surplus industrial population that then migrated to England and pushed down wages and conditions, and also the moral condition of the working class. And it's interesting because I think we disagree that this reserve army is surplus to the needs of capital. And I think you quote Mbabe quite approvingly. And actually, I actually try to show in my work on Libya and the militarization of the European borders in the Mediterranean, how actually this kind of global understanding that includes processes of neocolonial oppression, right, in the understanding of the reserve army of labor is helpful for understanding like contemporary processes of migration and unfree labor. And the other point, I think it's political, because when Marx was looking at Ireland, he also said, well, actually, I changed my mind about the dynamics of world revolution. I always thought that the English workers would liberate the colonies, but actually the opposite is true, and the lever must be applied in Ireland. And in their writings, they also anticipate César's analysis of the boomerang effect of colonialism, looking at how basically repression in Ireland was the basis of the repression and the kind of attacks on civil liberties also in England. So if we look at these kind of writings, which I think Marx systematizes in Capital Volume 1, we see that the dynamics of revolution and counter-revolution are not a national process, but are international processes in which anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles contribute to the class struggle in the core. And I have a series of questions, like in this light of this kind of framework, that I would like to make. Because I think it's interesting, Arun, when you look at kind of neoliberal racism, you try to basically root the understanding in the dynamics of insurgency and counterinsurgency in the neoliberal period, including the war on terror, etc. First of all, I disagree with your analysis of racial capitalism in South Africa, because I think that Legasik and Hampson are quite different from Wolpe in how they understand the household economy, and also that they see as fully integrated in the South African system, while for Wolpe represents a pre-capitalist economy. And so this is also important in terms of how we understand the solution to apartheid, which Legasik and Hampson saw as mass movements and international solidarity rather than national development. The second point, as you say, I think in various parts of your book, we see that the war on terror and neoliberal globalization have expanded the global reserve army of labor, and this has created a downward dynamics on wages and working conditions that has affected also the working classes in the global north, not just in the global south. And as in Marx's time, immigrant workers today can be a link, right, between struggles against colonialism, imperialism, and labor struggles and the labor movement in the North. So in this regard, what do you think about a topic which I think is a bit missing from the book, which is the dynamics of revolution and counter-revolution since 2011 with, uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt, and how these are important on the one side to see the kind of convergence of counter-revolutionary temporalities in Trumpism, where you have counter-jihadism, you have, Trump republicanism, you have alt-right conservatism, etc., which I think was studied by Ed Pertwee, which I thought wrote quite an interesting article about the counter-revolutionary temporality of Trumpism. But then on the other side, what does it say to us, right? When we think about the challenges of anti-racism or even the Black Lives Matter movement, right? In how we develop a response that is kind of as international as the far right today. So that's my questions, or these are my questions, and thank you.
Perfect, Lucia, right on time. I didn't even have to give you notice. If that's okay, Arun, I will give you 5 to 7, 8 minutes maximum to give us an overview of the responses you might have to these first questions, and then we will open the conversation to all the public.
Okay, well, thank you all so much for that. That's amazing, and you know, I really appreciate just the thoughtfulness with which you're thinking about the things I've tried to raise in the book, and I don't think I can address all of the things that have come up, but let me kind of go through some of it. So let's see. So maybe let me start with, let's start with a couple of things from John, right? So actually, just, you know, the thing about the white left that you mentioned, right? So I think that, you know, I try to be careful, right, about when I use the term white left and when I use the term white liberals. I don't throw them around easily, because there's lots of people who are left and lots of people who are liberal who aren't white, and vice versa, and so on. And so it's kind of like the danger of kind of collapsing things a little. But in the case of Harvey and Wendy Brown and that particular kind of set of ideas that I associate them with, and a broader kind of formation, right, around certain publications and certain strands of thinking in the US and the UK especially, it does seem to be the only way to understand that is as a white left, right? That its whiteness is not just coincidental to it. There's a form of thinking there that limits itself around questions of who this agency is, who is this subject that this left speaks to, right? So I do think it's appropriate in their case to use that term. And you know, the points about, so is it better to say anti-racism means anti-imperialism instead of anti-racism means anti-capitalism? You know, of course, you like the best version would be anti-racism means anti-imperialism and anti-capitalism. Less. I mean, the book title is already not the catchiest book title, right? But that would be even more clunky. So, you know, like I think you know, the I don't know how you can talk about either of those three things without talking about the other two, right? Like, it just seems like hopefully the argument, irrespective of the title, hopefully the argument in the book is clear enough that those three things always operate together, right? In at least in the forms of capitalism and racism and imperialism that we've experienced in the last few centuries, right? The question of whether the Palestinian movement, you know, that resistance can be co-opted or not, and whether there's something about the abolition request coming out of 2020 that whether that demand was somehow more co-optable in some way. I don't, you know, like I think the you know, the absorption of the PLO into the Palestinian Authority through the Oslo process to become the kind of satraps of Zionism is a process of co-option, right? As I mean, it was tied to repression, but it's also a process of co-opting what was the leading wing of the revolutionary movement, right, into the colonial system, right? So you know, I think that's, and you know, neoliberalism has been central to that, right? Like, I think there's a lot of kind of stuff to do with the idea coming out of Oslo that really what the Palestinians need is not liberation from Zionism and colonialism, but some form of market development and so on, right? And it's just like access to markets is really the solution for the Palestinians, right? And all that kind of language that was actually quite central to the Oslo process, right? But in that sense, that and obviously that's led to the corruption of the Palestinian Authority and a small elite that's able to get rich on the backs of ordinary Palestinians, right? And so that that has been as true of that struggle as it has been of the anti-racist struggle in the United States or other things that you might think about. If it's like like right now if you think about the UK or the United States, it's true that there's no co-option, right? But I don't rule it out, and at least in relatively, so in the United States, you will see next year, I think, you will see efforts by the Biden administration to co-opt the pro-Palestinian sentiments of Arab American voters, right, in the run-up to the election in all kinds of ways, like talking about Islamophobia, talking about anti-Arab racism and so on as a way to, and bringing in initiatives to deal with that, obviously in superficial ways, but in the way that co-option works. That will be there, right? So I'm not sure I agree with it that that there's just pure repression on this. And then so and then on this stuff about the different paths converging, right? It obviously like compared to the situation that say Huey Newton or Malcolm X faced in the 1960s, so much of their politics is about bringing what was a burgeoning and the liberation of third world countries from direct colonialism, right, was the reference point for everything they were doing, right? In a sense, you could almost describe their entire politics of the Panthers or Malcolm X or the Black Power movement as an attempt to import that revolutionary sentiment into the United States, right? Like so that it was the overwhelming reference point, right? And we don't have, and we're not in a similar situation, right? Now, what does that mean for us in terms of thinking about that kind of need to, like what does connecting the dots look like for us if that was what the 60s were about, right? Then, so firstly, the first thing is that it's still as true as it was then, that the Mississippi is tied to the Congo, right? Like the liberation of one is tied to the other just as much as it was there, if not in more intricate ways, right? So the basic structural terrain looks the same at that deeper level, right? And it may well be that that in particular contexts, right, that dynamic relationship between those two different terrains works in the reverse direction this time, right? It's perfectly possible to imagine like movements among racialized groups in Europe or in the United States having knock-on effects for movements in countries of origin in Africa or the Middle East or Asia or Latin America, right? Like, and that, there was something like that going on in the Arab, the Arab, coming to Lucia's question about 2011 and the Arab revolutions and so on, right? There was something like that dynamic going on there because a lot of the participants in those movements were veterans of struggles in Europe, right? Like Arabs who engage in anti-racist movements in Holland or in France and then go back to Egypt and actually participate in those movements there and bring something of those European struggles to, so that tells us that relationship is still there and the possibilities of flows across those in either direction are still there and politically significant, right? While we're on that, on Lucia's question about like what is how do we think about that and how do we think about internationalism in that? So for me, we have the problem that we have is that we've become very good since the last kind of 10 to 15 years. We've become very good at using the kind of the sort of infrastructure of mediated protest, if you want to call it that, right, to to be able to rapidly bring together crowds that are partly online and partly on the streets to engage in ways that seem almost spontaneous but aren't, on particular issues that get thrown up in particular moments, like the Arab Spring, if you want to call it that, right? What we can't do very well, and what our ancestors did a lot better, is then understand how to organize ourselves to move forward from that particular seemingly spontaneous moment, right? So we then build this opening, and we don't know where to go with it, or we haven't got the capacity to go anywhere with it. And then it's possible for right-wing forces to take that and use it for their ends. You know, like you see that very clearly in 2013 in Brazil, where something that you know springs up around the question of public transport and so on, then gets co-opted by what later becomes the Bolsonaro movement, right? So it's a failure of organization, actually, right? It's a failure of our ability to know how to organize and to have an organizing capacity that we used to have, but that we don't have anymore. And partly that's because of an analytical problem, where I think even though we think we're using a radical language of of needing to take on structures of capitalism, of kind of we use these big words, and we think we know what they mean, but I'm not sure we do know what they mean, like at a grassroots level, in terms of people doing stuff on the ground and how they think about what they're doing. I don't know if we do know what we mean by that, right? And I don't think we understand that it's not a matter of taking position. So much of what we do is taking positions. Have I got the correct position on this issue or that issue, right? Am I putting out the correct statements? I mean, unless you represent some kind of organized group, putting out statement doesn't mean anything, right? Like if you represent an organized group, then putting out a statement is a declaration of potential actions that you might take as an organized formation. But if you're not an organized formation, if you're just an individual or just part of some vague trend, then you're not really, there's no point putting out positions. You should be spending your time doing organizing work, right? Which is a completely different thing. And that's where we've failed, because that stuff was broken, right? Like that's part of what neoliberalism did to us, was to break our sense of collectivism, right? Which has to underpin organizing, right? And they targeted that explicitly. They broke that, and so we've grown up with that failure to think in those collective ways. Even when we talk about collective organizing, we're not sure we're doing very much of it. That's what we need to rebuild, and to do that, we need to have a clearer sense of what it means to be up against the structure of power, and what kinds of things then we can do to oppose that go beyond just taking positions, right? And having the correct and thinking we've got the correct analysis of a particular structure and so on, right? That's where I think the weakness is. When we think about
sorry, Arun, could you probably spend 2 more minutes?
Yes. Okay. So then let me pick up on let's see. Right. So I haven't spoken about Vanessa's question. So Vanessa's question about let's see, how can we, so the idea that we need to get away from just this kind of classical model of the industrial wage worker in Europe, and we broaden out our sense of where revolutionary change might come from, and think about these groups that are surplus and so on, and then is labor still central, and then how can we bring these strands together, right? So I think that when we're thinking about, if we want to use this, if we want to think about surplus resistance, right? I think the struggles of surplus populations are they're not going to resemble, by definition almost, right? They're not going to resemble the classic ideas of what labor organizing looks like, right? But they're not outside labor, right? Labor is still central to their experience of economic life, right? It's just that it's not organized through capitalist wage labor, right? I think labor is still going to be a central part of the kind of political movements that come out of surplus populations, but it's just not going to be recognizable in the ways that it that would fit the sort of conventional European paradigm of what labor industrial action looks like. I don't think, so I think firstly, there are we have not kind of the potential for industrial labor organizing in the world today is way beyond what we're actually doing, right? So let's not forget that firstly, right? Like it may not be centered on Europe and the United States in the way that the kind of classical model would have done, but huge potential for industrial organizing around the world, right? That looks like something like what would have happened in the kind of classic history of the European labor movement, i.e. unionizing, using your capacity to withdraw labor as a point of leverage to bring change, right? So that is it's not like we need to throw that away at any point, right? That's a huge potential we're not actually using. But then also we need to recognize that outside that there are going to be all these other kinds of struggles that may not immediately be recognizable as anti-capitalist struggles, but are actually anti-capitalist struggles, right? And those could be, the landless movement in Brazil, right? Which are doing a whole number of things, but some of the things they're doing is occupying land and building economic activity on that land, right? Which is exactly what you would predict would happen if you have this analysis of a surplus population as this kind of structural feature of capitalism, right? I don't believe that it's simply understandable in terms anymore of a reserve army of labor, in that kind of 19th century Marxist way, right? I think it's something more than that. But we can kind of get into the weeds on that perhaps another time. All right, thank you, everyone. I really appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Arun, and thanks to all the discussants. This has been great so far. We will open the floor, and I can already see one hand up from Alex Kalinikos. And then if other people want to, I encourage everyone to raise their hand and participate, but if someone for some reason cannot, you can also type your questions in the chat. So Alex, up to you.
Okay, thanks very much, Arun, and the other discussants, and thanks, Arun, for a great book. I just want to focus on the question of, well, I want to get into the weeds about the reserve army of labor, because I think you're completely right to insist on the relationship between neoliberalism and racism. And anyone who's been through the experience of Thatcherism in Britain, prefigured by Powell, which you discuss in depth, would understand that. But it doesn't seem to me that contemporary racism, and I'm not entirely sure whether it still makes sense to call it neoliberal racism, because neoliberalism is kind of destructuring so much. It hasn't disappeared, but it's partially disintegrating, to see it as about dealing with surplus populations in the sense of populations that are no longer involved in wage labor. Because it seems to me that part of, not the ideologists like Powell or Hayek, but part of what neoliberalism as a functioning form of capitalism did was hugely to increase the reserve army of labor, and to restructure capitalism in a way that made it heavily dependent on flows of migrant labor. And the fact that there's so much bordering doesn't alter that, because it's still enough people get through, in very vulnerable circumstances, to become super exploitable labor, not just in the metropolises, but in the major capitalisms of the South as well. It seems to me this is crucial to understanding how both capitalism and racism function today. And in a way, the example of Palestine is instructive, because the fact that the Israeli state and the Israeli political elite can now contemplate a genocidal solution is indeed because of the way in which the Palestinians have been increasingly excluded from the labour market. But what's made that possible is reliance on other forms of migrant or semi-migrant labour. The influx of Russian Jews is now, of Soviet Jews, is now a generation away. But isn't it interesting that among the hostages were all these Thai workers? You know, that's the kind of migrant force that contemporary Israeli capitalism relies on. It's too dangerous for it because of the reliance of the Israeli form of settler colonialism on the dispossession and exclusion of the Palestinians to rely on Palestinian wage labor. So it gets it from all over the world. So this, for me, illustrates the sense in which capitalism today, globalized, etc., continues to rely on reserve army fueled by flows of migration, which in turn has all sorts of implications, both for how racism functions, but also how class struggles function. Muslims in Britain aren't outside the productive economy. I mean, I come from London. London runs on Muslim labour. If you look at the people who are doing particularly the manual work, it's people of South Asian and Arab origin, primarily of the Muslim faith. So I like a great deal of what you say in your book, but I have a huge reservation on this specific point. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Alex. If there's nobody else who wants to raise their hands, oh yes, there are a few names. Perfect. Yes, Aniket Chandar.
Yeah, am I audible?
Yes.
Yeah, I guess my question was more towards, I guess, the possibility of maybe the dangers of using certain terms of anti-imperialism or and anti-colonial language, because I mean, especially when we're talking about, if we're talking about the Lenin's understanding of imperialism in terms of the hegemonic capitalist states exploiting the dependent states. So how do you situate the agency of specifically repressive developmentalist states in the, I guess, in the third world? And also, what do you do about, I guess my question is more towards, what do you do about far-right fundamentalists who adopt language of decolonial language and anti-colonial language to also separate other ethnic groups in pluralistic societies, to label them as foreigners, and which could give rise to nativism, is, I guess, my question. And how conducive is it to an international understanding of how capitalism operates? Because is it more useful to view a lot of these processes as versions of capitalism, or do these terms actually have use in themselves, is my question.
Thank you. And sorry, I apologize for not having been very structured in organizing this Q&A. I think a good way to go will be to take questions in groups of 4 or 5, and then giving again the chance to our discussants to reply. So after the first 2 questions we had, I will give the word first to Virginia, then to Max, and then to Farah. And then after the 3 of you, we can give the mic back to our discussants. So Virginia, up to you. Virginia, can you hear us? You're muted.
Okay, am I unmuted now? Oh, okay. Thanks, Arun, very much. But I couldn't help but immediately respond to your comment about racial surplus population, to what is immediately going on in Britain today, where, and how you sort of, if you can fit that in, where it seems as if nobody is going to be welcome into Britain if they're earning less than 38,000 pounds, unless they're on a fixed, they can earn 15,000 pounds and no more, but they can't bring in their children. And the sort of comparison of Britain with other European countries as being the lowest in terms of welfare provision and highest in terms of inequality. I mean, is it the snake coming back to bite us all in the ass, so to speak, or how do you sort of fit all that in, this classism, essentially, with the racially defined surplus population? I'm not saying that it isn't obviously still in existence, but is there a blend now of classism and racism here that's very much more obvious? Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Virginia. Max, up to you.
Hi, thanks so much for this. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the place of disability and disablement in this sort of nexus of racism and capitalism, obviously thinking of C.L.R, the right to maim, this idea that disability and debility is sort of meted out as a way of controlling populations, but also thinking about the stuff, the role of disabled people sometimes as part of this reserve army of the unemployed, sometimes as kind of actively excluded from it, sometimes produced by dangerous working conditions that enact disablement. I'm still sort of thinking about how all these pieces fit together, and I'd love to hear from you about where you see that being part of it. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you. Farah, and then, so Farah goes first, and then I'll also give the word to Sean, and then we can wrap all those questions together. Thank you.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. Yeah, so I'm a GP, and I'm also of the Muslim faith. And in London, we have nearly 50% of our primary care workforce are from Black minority ethnic, and also they are a large proportion of international medical graduates. And so I just wanted to sort of just make sure that the narrative is not that it's just manual labor, but it's actually the skilled workforce in the UK. It constitutes a very large proportion of those people. And secondly, I wanted to also make sure that we're talking about mass extractivism and the link between that and capitalism and racism as well, and the part that plays. Obviously, there's a big interest in the Middle East because of gas and oil reserves, especially in Gaza now, and there's a link between sort of mass extractivism, mass murder, and the utilization of the tools of inequality, racism, sexism, all of these things to enable mass extractivism. So those were the two comments that I wanted to raise.
Thank you so much. Sean?
Oh, yeah. Thank you very much for all those talks. I'm wondering, like, given that the most dynamic part of region of global capitalism now is East Asia, and in particular China, and China's coming from a different history from than the West. I mean, so of course they were subject to Western imperialism and also Japanese imperialism, and under Mao they were committed to anti-colonialism, and now the main cleavage in China, I would argue, is class. So the urban versus rural, super exploitation based on the hukou system, not race. So is it Eurocentric to say that racism is primary structural feature of capitalism, or do we need to specify that we're talking about Western capitalism? Thank you.
Thank you, Sean. Eva, you go as well, and then we'll go back to Arun. Yes, Eva. Please.
Oh, sorry. sorry. I didn't hear you very well. Thanks so much. This was an incredible talk and also amazing set of comments and questions. I think I have a question that maybe now ties in a little bit with some of the points raised by Alex Kalinikos and Lucia Pradella. At some point, if I understood correctly, you sort of go back to Hayek and kind of try to articulate the ways in which sort of racism or through ideas of cultural superiority or inferiority or suitability to the market was a way to rationalize the inability of capital to universalize itself. And I wondered a bit more about this word of failure. I mean, to the extent to which you see sort of capitalism as something that tends. I wasn't clear. Sometimes it appeared that do we see capitalism as something that tends toward homogenizing, or as you also implied somewhere else, in which case it's a failure to sort of universalize, or as you implied somewhere else, do we see capitalism as requiring kind of difference because it requires different levels of different kinds of labor and different kinds of rates of exploitation, etc. And I ask also because when I think of gender, for example, and I think of gender as a form of abstraction that sort of in some ways might in some senses relegates sort of domestic work, makes it naturalizes it outside the sphere of capitalist production, but also sometimes just in the ways in which women are included in the workforce, particular kinds of jobs are feminized. So you can see care labor, etc., are feminized jobs, and hence gender operates. Gender as the feminine gender operates as a category that allows sort of surplus value itself, sort of by different kind of processes of extracting more value by sort of keeping wages lower, for example. So I'm just wanted to recap whether sort of this notion of racism just being about a failure for capitalism to universalize itself, or a reflection of the necessary structural differentiation that capitalism requires for the process of valorization is more suited. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I was a bit muddled.
That's great. Thank you very much, everyone, for all these very, very good questions. I will give the floor back to Arun. There's also a few interesting comments, in the chat, in case our participants can go and have a read at them before they take their turns. But I think you already have enough to start a reply, Arun. So up to you.
Okay, thank you for all of those questions. That's great. So I guess let me start maybe with the questions that are about Asia. So the question of China, right? And this is Sean's question, is it Eurocentric to say racism is a structuring relationship of capitalism? Well, I mean, I think the example of China points to exactly how that claim is true, right? Because if you think about the more capitalist that China has become, the more it has, for example, imported Islamophobia from the West in the way that it's operating in Uyghur. So I think there's all kinds of ways that you could kind of see that relationship playing out in China. Not a China expert, but it seems to me that would be one way of answering that question. The other part of this is, I think the question of racism comes in not just within a country, but in terms of that country's relationship to the rest of the world, right? And the kind of its positioning in the world system, which is organized through race. And so I think there's that part of it. I think also a lot of this comes down to what we mean by structural, right? I don't think there's any, and this brings us to Eva's question as well. I don't think there's any kind of like at a highly theoretical level, it's possible to imagine capitalism operating without racism. It hasn't done it, and the prospect of it is way off in the distance. What it isn't possible to imagine, I think, is a capitalism that is able to do away with any kind of race-like social differentiation, right? Like some kind of way of organizing the different peoples in the world in such a way that that doesn't assume that there's something fixed inherent to the collective properties of those people that explains unequal outcomes in the world, right? Like, I think that's not possible, and you know, again, in relation to Eva's question, the reason it's not possible is because I do think that there are inherent reasons why the kind of idea of a capital labor relationship that looks like volume 1 of Capital, right? The kind of story of exploitation that's described there. I do think there's inherent reasons why that relationship between capital and labor cannot be universalized. That cannot be the sole story of how capital relates to labor in the world. And if that's true, you're going to have multiple relationships between capital and labor, and there's going to have to be some kind of story that capitalism tells about why the story of free labor that you get in Capital Volume 1 is not, or ostensibly free, perhaps we should say, is not universal. And it's that failure to universalize that then requires the social differentiation as a story around that social differentiation that might be something like race or some other kind of category like it, that becomes a necessity, right? So China is no different in that sense, right? I think that is a structural, that, you know, if we understand it that way, I think it is a structural feature of capitalism. Now, let me say something about Alex's comments about this question of the reserve army of labor. I think I agree with quite a lot of what you're saying. I agree with you that this form of capitalism that we've seen over the last few decades is heavily dependent on flows of migrant labor, although we shouldn't overstate that, because of course, you know, 19th century Manchester had, you know, a migrant population of like 1 in 3 workers or something like that. So, you know, these aren't necessarily, you know, entirely new situations. But so the story I would tell is that neoliberalism, as you say, forget the ideology for the moment, but the reality of neoliberalism does generate huge numbers of people who are kind of thrown up they're removed from their existing livelihoods through what we can call it primitive accumulation, call it original accumulation, whatever you want to do, and they then become recruited to become these kind of migrant laborers in other parts of the world, right? I agree with you that I mean, I think the system depends on those migrant laborers structurally, right? Because they provide this highly exploitable labor force. I think the system needs to tell a story about how that situation can coexist with you know, how does it justify essentially a segregated labor force, which in countries like Britain is often racially segregated, right? Like, so, and you know, United States, same would be true. This is a form of racial segregation when we think about the separate regimes of rights for workers in the especially in the undocumented migrant category, right? That is all true. There are, though, I mean, if you think about that process of original accumulation across the whole globe, the ones who are able to somehow enter into a work relationship with capital through becoming migrants and moving to, whether it's Britain or whether it's Israel as Thai migrants or whatever, that's actually a fraction of the people who are kind of thrown onto this global scrap, right? For most of them, that's not what they end up doing, and so for, you know, so to that extent, the question of reserve army of labor is a little different, because it may be that for those people, they never enter any form of relationship where they can be called a kind of army of labor that's brought in and out at different, you know, economic upturns and downturns and so on, right? So if that's true, then the question is, does their mere existence outside of any kind of capitalist relationship nevertheless have the same effect as a reserve army of labor, even if they never enter into? That's where we get into more complex questions. My argument would be, I'm drawing here on the work of Kalyan Sanyal in India, especially, to say I don't think it is like a reserve army of labor anymore. But hopefully that at least clarifies where we are agreed and where we might part company. In the case of, I think the genocidal impulse in Zionism has been there right from the beginning, right? And I don't know that I would agree with you that somehow now it's possible to carry it off in a new way, simply because of the possibilities of having a Thai labor force. I think Zionism is not as neatly reducible to a question of labor in that way, in terms of when it has found Palestinian labor necessary to exploit and when it has not. I think there is, I think the fundamental feature of Zionism is settler colonialism, not a question of a kind of reserve army of labor dynamic or something like that. And settler colonialism always means that the native population is surplus, right? That it's vulnerable to elimination and expulsion, rather than incorporation as some kind of exploited workforce, even temporarily. And of course, it's true that the categories that ideologically are used to think through and manage surplus populations, like Black, like Muslim, like migrant, and so on, don't exactly correspond to the reality of who technically is surplus and who is not, and so on, right? But that doesn't have to be true for those categories still to function in that way, as neoliberal think tanks and policymakers and the business class and so on attempt to think through how to deal with the contradictions their own system has thrown up around this problem of neoliberalism producing huge numbers of populations that aren't actually going to be possible to incorporate into waged labor. Let me just say something quickly on, I think, is it Oni's question about how do we think about the agency of governments in the Global South and the far-right fundamentalists in the Global South who adopt this anti-colonial language? Two things. One is there's nothing incompatible with, on the one hand, understanding that imperialism remains a structure of domination in the world, and two, opposing far-right governments that have that use a kind of anti-colonial language that is entirely superficial, of course. Opposing those governments tooth and nail. And in fact, the clearer we are about what the actual reality of imperialism looks like in the current world system, the more able we will be to expose the superficiality of, like say in India, the BJP's rhetoric around wanting to create their own IT sector to avoid, the digital colonialism coming from Silicon Valley. Well, if we actually understand the structure here, we can show very much more easily how the IT structure that is planned in India is entirely going to be interconnected with the global system and entirely integrated into whatever kinds of structures Silicon Valley is building as well, right? So, I think there's no contradiction there. I guess I'm out of time, Diego. So let me end there. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Arun. I think it would be good also to hear back from Vanessa, John, and Lucia. Some of the questions were addressed to you, and some of the questions were also general. So surely, if you have any insight and anything to add, please. And I think we can follow the same order. First Vanessa, then John, and then Lucia to close.
Thank you. There are so many, I think, important questions and points were raised. I maybe briefly want to say something about the relation between surplusification and super exploitation, because I think it's important to really stress, but also to analyze further the relation between the two, because I think there is a huge component of coexistence here. And usually, the kind of abolitionist strand coming from racial capitalism analysis, famously Gilmore and others, make that point with regards to prison expansion, police expansion, very, I think, importantly, with regards to, this is not so much about exploitation, right? The prison is not just an extension of the plantation, which was about super exploitation, but is rather a kind of warehousing or managing of the surplus population as a result of processes of capitalist deindustrialization, outsourcing, and flexibility of capital and global neoliberalization. So I think a kind of task today is not just saying, okay, Marx already got it all, or I don't know, third world Marxists already got this all. But I think with regards to the neoliberal conjuncture, the task is really now to kind of understand that relation, because obviously exploitation, by capitalists still like what is running the capitalist system. And you see that with the question of migration, particularly if we think, for instance, and I think you mentioned it also, Lucia, with regards to the European border regime, right? Frontex, the Mediterranean Sea, what have you. And I think there we see the simultaneity, right, of super exploitation, migrant labor still being needed, recruited, what have you. And at the same time, you have mass deportations, right? And a deportation regime that is completely like increasing, escalating since the 1980s, as well as mass deaths on the Mediterranean Sea. And I think that shows the kind of simultaneity or coexistence of surplus, of the production of surplus populations, as well as ongoing super exploitation, right? And with ongoing, I'm not saying kind of non-shifting with regards to its modality. So I think it's really important to look at how this relation actually unfolds. Yeah, maybe I'll just leave it there for like one point, I think, for us to think further. And I think racism plays a specific role here. And maybe just to relate to something that was also then mentioned in the chat, not just as a kind of ideology that actually divides the worker, right? But as a kind of technology that actually as a technology of differentiation that enables the kind of various forms of labor and how they relate to capital, including the rendering of surplus populations. So what I want to say, it's not an either or. I just wanted to, because there were also some questions in the chat where I find that important to stress.
Thank you, Vanessa. John, up to you. There's also a question on the chat. It's a very clear and succinct question by Miraculova that says, how do we combat systemic racism in public institutions? So maybe you also want to have a go.
Are you gonna give me that one?
Yeah, why not?
Well, look, I did a training session for the TUC last week, and I said, look, give up on unconscious bias and be consciously biased against unconscious bias. Focus on institutions and practices and outcomes. That might be one solution. Or failing that, abolish the institution. But hey, I don't know. Maybe that's the way forwards. I do think we need to counter the idea that racism is just within the heart of white people. I find that kind of it's a weird thing where, and then certain well-meaning white people often declare at meetings that they are racist and biased, and I don't know, a bit like Siva once said, I don't care. I don't care if you're racist. I care if your institutions are racist. I just wanted to have a brief comment on the question about whether, the use of the terms decolonization or anti-imperialism, which are being used normally incorrectly by ghouls, whether we should think about that. And I think one of the things I want to stress is that I think there's a narrative going around that replicates the 1990s idea that the world is flat, but not with neoliberal imperatives, but that the world is flat now because essentially there are other poles of power, so the world is flat. And I think that's really dangerous because that destabilizes the idea of imperialism. And I think that's where a lot of this is coming from. So how can you talk about imperialism when you have China and you have, say, India, or you have India has, like, you have the BRICS. What do we do? And I think there's a dangerous narrative here, because it then leaves behind all of these things about racism and other logics, because then the world is rendered flat again, or multipolar. And I think we had a good discussion about imperialisms and sub-imperialisms about that in a previous seminar and the workshops we did a couple of months back, which people can watch online. And I think that's interesting, because actually anti-racism centers back into that debate about imperialism. And this is what I was trying to get at. Anti-racism without anti-imperialism, to me, doesn't make sense. Like, otherwise it's just an inclusive, it lends itself to being inclusive. And so if it is most provocative as anti-imperialism, I think that's when you end up with the repression. And so that's what I was want to say about that. But that's also a contradictory thing, right? Like, give you a good example. When we looked at COVID-19 vaccines and patents, which were fundamentally racialized in the way that the patents were kind of, flew through an international form of institutional racism, right? Which is the WTO, patent laws, IMF. We see that infrastructure enforces a form of international institutional racism. But actually the contradiction in that was India, which is a far-right led basket case of a nation state now, not the people, but the state, yeah? And I don't know if you saw the pictures of Modi with Maloney. What are they called? Melody? That's what they're called, right? There you have kind of... Melody? Is that what they're called? Melody. There you have European far-right fascism mixing with Hindutva fascism and getting on, But ironically, when it came to the patents thing, it was India that raised the suspension of patents. So it isn't an either-or system. It's a contradictory system of hangovers of state-led anti-imperialism, and also conjunctures of where, the people are attempting to fight back even against states that are also fascist, but also in some ways pushing at the kind of power relations of the old imperial model, right? So nation states like India want in. They don't want to change it, they want in. So, I think we have to be really careful about how we approach these things. The world is definitely not flat, and anti-racism leads us to understand that the world is not flat. Yeah, I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, John. Lucia, would you like to?
Okay. I think I'll go back to the surplus population issues. It's one of the hot topics of this evening. Well, I think we need to do a bit more to push our global understanding of the working class. And I think you engaged with this in the book as well, Arun. I think actually, if you look at the economy that Marx was analyzing in 1860s, I mean, Britain was an imperial economy that included all the colonies as part, where there was, labor mobility, as you talk about in your book, capital mobility. Actually, capital was more invested abroad than at home. So it was really a highly integrated economy. And I think that his understanding of the class struggle included this kind of dynamics of universalization of the wage labor relation that also basically shapes pre-capitalist forms of modes of forms of production that are shaped by the dominant relation. And I don't think, and that's why I side with Legasik and Hampson, I don't think they're outside of the capitalist mode of production, are actually inside, and they're shaped by the dominant form, even if the mode of exploitation is not dominantly the wage labor form. So that's my position. I personally think that one of the main goals of the war on terror was to create and expand the global surplus population. I don't think it's just a byproduct of the war on terror. And I actually think, and I actually challenge and engage with the literature, there are several authors who actually believe that people are actually surplus to the needs of the capitalist system. I actually believe that this is quite a problematic understanding of the surplus population. And actually, that is actually what the violence of the border wants to give us the impression, that these people are really surplus. right? That they are not needed when this isn't true. And I think, well, I spent quite a lot working on Libya because I couldn't understand after 2015 or, what was going on. There was like very strong message. We need to, stop the immigration of these people. And so I talked to a lot of African immigrants, actually, who worked in Italian agriculture. And what came out is that actually many of the people who were there didn't want to come to Europe in the first place. So it's been the neocolonial aggression by NATO, which, by the way, I think we need to understand as a process of counter-revolution, because it was aimed also at avoiding and impeding the kind of radicalization and the connection of the uprisings across the region, that actually destroyed the Libyan economy, which was one of the main countries of immigration, created and expanded the reserve army of labor of Western capital in Libya. And at the same time, all the violence of, the militias, the detention centers, etc., is not really aimed at stopping people, but at the same time, stops them there, but at the same time pushes people towards Europe, because the only, when you are there in detention or wherever you are, the only option is to go to Europe. You can't go back to your country. There are no the infrastructures to go back. And so this has stopped the process of circular migration from Western Africa, and has created new reserve armies of labor who are then super exploited if and when they survive the crossing in Europe. And so, yeah, this I think this is an important point. I think it's quite relevant to understanding the current situation, and well, I don't know, something maybe to discuss more in future.
Thank you very much, Lucia, and thank you, everyone. We still have a couple of minutes left in case, Arun, would you like to just offer us a closing remark?
A closing remark. Well, look, I really appreciate all the comments and questions. I think so I'm not sure. I think the first thing coming out for me is trying to clarify like where we are on the same page and where we differ on particular issues. I'm not sure. I wonder what it means to say whether a particular labor relationship is inside or outside capitalism. We agree that it's within a broader system of domination, right? So, like, what does it mean to say inside or outside? I'm not sure. We can kind of continue that conversation. The question of borders, I think, is I think whether we think of borders as producing surplus populations that say Europe needs, or whether but in a subordinated way, or whether we think of them as doing something else that's about holding back surplus populations from entering. Like both of those things are clearly true, right? So again, it seems like we're not necessarily in either or positions on a lot of these things that we're talking about. Same with, I think Vanessa's absolutely right that the question of surplusification versus exploitation, super exploitation is, again, it's not an either or. It's about how these things are integrated together. I think the key thing, though, that where all this ought to go is to think about what does this mean for our movements, right? And like what I hope the book is part of is a conversation that we haven't had as often as we should about how like we can have the kind of conversations at the abstract level about racism and capitalism and the different ways we might think of those two working together. But in the end, it, of course, as we all know, has to translate into new creative ways of thinking about our political response to that, right? And how do we connect with the movements that are actually happening and use this work that we're doing on the thinking side to actually enhance what those movements are capable of doing, right? You know, I think we need a much better kind of mapping of the global picture of the movements that are out there doing all kinds of challenges to capitalism that I don't think a lot of the time we're even seeing, even though they're often well organized and mass movements in various parts of the world, and then thinking about does this form of analysis that we're doing, whether we think of it in terms of surplus populations, racial capitalism, does it enable us to make sense of those movements and start making connections between those movements and other struggles around the world? Because in the end, this is what analysis needs to do, is to give us a story that enables us to connect together different struggles that people are fighting, to build the kinds of unity that have been broken up so powerfully by neoliberalism over the last few decades, to bring back that sense of collectivism, that sense of internationalism that we need if we're going to have any chance of dismantling these structures that we're trying to think through, right? So like at the end of the day, I want us to have a story that connects, because it's those connecting stories that that mean that someone fighting somewhere else in the world can say, okay, I'm fighting tooth and nail against this issue on this issue here, but I can see through this analysis, through this story we tell, that it's actually connected to a struggle that you're fighting over there. And that's how we can, in the end, that's how we build solidarity. It's not through some kind of position that we take in the abstract. It's through seeing that we're all fighting against this same system, right? And unless we can tell a story that does that, we're not going to be able to build those kinds of solidarity. So yeah, thank you all for being part of that work of trying to do that. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Arun, and everyone else, all our discussants and everyone asking questions and just staying through these 2 very interesting hours and listening to us. This was the last event of the seminar of the year of 2023, but we will be back in January, details to be confirmed, with a very good list of events for the coming year. So stay tuned, visit our YouTube channel, as I've put the link on the chat. Sign up to the email list if you haven't so far, and enjoy the end of the year. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you, Diego. You're the best chair.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for a great seminar.
Thanks, Vanessa.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for the great conversation.
Bye then.
Great book.
Everyone.
Happy Christmas.
See you tomorrow on the Strand if you're in London, yeah?
Or
no Christmas this year.
At the rally in Parliament, I believe.
Yeah.
We don't celebrate. Do we?
No, not this year.
No.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, 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 bye.
Or do I?